January 15th, 1919. Boston's North End. Just past noon. Giuseppe Iantosca stands at the second-floor window of a tenement on Charter Street, watching his son. The boy is 10 years old. His name is Pasquale. That morning, Giuseppe had bundled him into not one, but two crimson sweaters, the kind a careful father puts on a small boy, even on a strangely warm winter day. Pasquale is in the street below, gathering broken pieces of wood for the family stove. He is gathering them near the tank. The tank is enormous, 50 feet tall, 90 feet across. A wall of steel painted a deep, sticky brown, looming over the neighborhood like a misplaced industrial moon. It has stood there for 3 years. It has been leaking for almost as long. Pasquale's friends, when no one is watching, fill cans and buckets with the molasses that seeps down its seams. Free candy. Giuseppe watches his son. The boy is in his line of sight. He is safe. Then a sound, like machine gun fire or a passing train, or both at once. Steel rivets snap and fire through the air like bullets. The wall of the tank gives way, and a wave of dark, sticky death, 25 feet high, 160 feet wide, moving 35 miles an hour, comes for everything in front of it. Giuseppe Iantosca will search the streets of the North End for hours. He will come home alone. This is the story of the Great Boston Molasses Flood, a disaster so strange that history almost forgot to take it seriously, and of the 21 people who paid for that forgetting with their lives. To understand what fell on Pasquale Iantosca, you have to understand what built it. In 1915, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, was one of the most profitable industrial firms in the country. The reason was simple: war. In Europe, the First World War had been grinding through trenches for over a year. The Allies, Britain, France, soon to be joined by the United States, needed explosives, dynamite, smokeless powder, cordite, and industrial alcohol was a valuable wartime chemical used in the production of munitions and other military supplies. You could make industrial alcohol from a lot of things, but the cheapest, most plentiful raw material in 1915 was molasses, shipped in by the tanker load from Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the West Indies. Heat the molasses, ferment it, distill it, and you had ethanol ready to be turned into wartime products. USIA already had a distillery in Cambridge, just across the Charles River from Boston. What it didn't have was a place to store its own raw material. It was buying tank space from competitors. It was paying retail. With war prices climbing and demand exploding, USIA decided to take control of its own supply chain. They needed a tank, a huge one, right on the Boston waterfront, so molasses tankers could unload directly into it. They needed it fast. And here we meet our villain. His name was Arthur P. Gell. He was the company's treasurer. He was not an engineer. He was not an architect. He had no construction experience. He had, according to courtroom testimony that would emerge years later, no ability to read a blueprint at all. This was the man USIA put in charge of building a 5-story steel tank that would hold 2.5 million gallons of liquid in the middle of a densely populated immigrant neighborhood. Gell had a deadline. The first shipment of Cuban molasses was scheduled to arrive on December 31st, 1915. The tank had to be ready by then. So Gell did what panicked men in over their heads always do. He cut corners. Engineering inspection of the steel? Not arranged. Plans reviewed by an architect? Never happened. The standard safety test for a new tank of this size, filling it with water to check for leaks under load, Gell skipped it. Instead, he ordered the tank tested with 6 inches of water. 6 inches. In a structure designed to hold a column of molasses 50 feet deep. The tank passed. Of course it did. On December 31st, 1915, the first 1.3 million gallons of Cuban molasses were pumped in. Almost immediately, the tank began to leak. It leaked from the seams. It leaked from the rivets. It leaked from cracks that no one had inspected because no one had been hired to inspect them. The workers at the tank noticed something else. When the tank was being filled, it groaned, a deep metallic moan that traveled across the waterfront. One of those workers was a man named Isaac Gonzalez. Gonzalez was a purity distilling employee assigned to the commercial street tank. He watched the leaks, he heard the groans, and he understood, in the gut way that working men understand industrial machinery, that the tank was failing. He told his bosses, repeatedly. His bosses dismissed him. Gonzalez started having trouble sleeping. He would lie awake at night, then get up, walk down to the waterfront in the dark, and check the tank. He could not stop thinking about what would happen if it gave way. On at least one occasion, a different laborer brought Arthur Gell shards of steel that had cracked off the tank's wall and laid them on the treasurer's desk. According to courtroom testimony given years later, Gell looked at the shards and replied, "I don't know what you want me to do. The tank still stands." The tank still stands. That was USIA's engineering philosophy, and Gell's response to the leaks was not to fix them, it was to hide them. In 1918, he ordered the entire tank repainted, from its original steel gray to a deep, syrupy brown, so that the molasses dribbling down its sides would no longer be visible against the metal. That September, Isaac Gonzalez resigned. He could not, in good conscience, keep collecting a paycheck from the tank. 4 months later, he would be one of the only people inside the United States Industrial Alcohol Company who had warned them and walked away. The war ended in November of 1918. The munitions boom was over. But molasses had other uses. It could be distilled into grain alcohol, the ordinary, legal, drinkable kind. And in the winter of 1918 and 1919, USIA had every commercial reason to keep the Commercial Street tank as full as it could. The molasses was already paid for. The buyers were still waiting. You will sometimes hear a darker version of those final weeks, that USIA was racing the clock, scrambling to sell every gallon it could before national prohibition shut the door. The timing is real. The 18th Amendment was moving through the state legislatures that very winter. But prohibition would not take legal effect until January of 1920, a full year after our disaster. On January 15, 1919, alcohol was still entirely legal. Whether USIA was truly racing prohibition or simply behaving like any company sitting on a tank full of valuable product, historians genuinely disagree. What is not in dispute is this. In the weeks before the disaster, USIA kept that tank as full as it could. On January 12, 1919, 3 days before the disaster, a ship docked at the Commercial Street wharf carrying a fresh load of warm molasses from Cuba, roughly 600,000 gallons. The molasses was warm because warming it lowered its viscosity for the transfer. The colder molasses already in the tank was sluggish. The warm Cuban shipment was thinner, more active. When the two mixed, something happened that USIA's 6-inch water test had never anticipated. The warmer molasses began to ferment. Fermentation produces gas. The gas had nowhere to go. Pressure began to build inside a tank whose walls were already dangerously thinner than they should have been. The next 2 days were brutally cold. On January 13th, the temperature in Boston bottomed out near 2 degrees Fahrenheit. The steel of the tank, brittle in the cold and missing the manganese that would have made it more flexible, contracted. Then came January 15th. The morning broke unusually warm. By lunchtime, the temperature on Commercial Street had climbed above 40 degrees. People came outside. Workers rolled up their sleeves. Children, sent home for the school lunch break, lingered in the streets longer than usual. Let me show you the neighborhood as it stood at 20 minutes past noon. 3 children, Pasquale Iantosca in his red sweaters, 8-year-old Antonio D'Estasio, and Antonio's 10-year-old sister Maria, are near the base of the tank, gathering scraps of firewood for their families. They are not supposed to be there. Above them, at his 2nd-floor window, Giuseppe Iantosca watches his son. A block away at the Engine 31 firehouse, firefighters are inside during the lunch hour. George Lay, a firefighter assigned there, is among them. Inside a house overlooking the tank, Martin Cloherty, a saloon keeper who runs a place called the Pen and Pencil Club, is asleep on the 3rd floor. He worked late. His mother Bridget, 65 years old, is downstairs. So is his sister. So is a boarder. On Commercial Street itself, Patrolman Frank McManus has stopped at a police call box to make a routine check-in with headquarters. He is, by accident, about to become the first official voice to report what happens next. And William White, the superintendent of the Purity Distilling Company, the man whose job it is to actually supervise the tank, has stepped out for a lunch errand with his wife. The tank, this leaking, groaning, painted-over structure, is unsupervised. Sometime between 12:30 and 12:45 p.m., it gave way. The sound came first. Witnesses, when they were later asked to describe it, reached for whatever loud thing they knew. Some said machine gun fire. Some said a train. Some said it was both, a continuous percussive ripping. What they were hearing was the rivets of the tank firing off, one after another, like rounds from a Gatling gun. The steel walls were unzipping themselves. Some of that flying steel became shrapnel, breaking windows, tearing through the air, and adding to the violence before the molasses even arrived. And then the molasses came. 2.3 million gallons of it, 13,000 tons. A wave that was, at its center, 25 feet high, and at its widest, more than 160 feet across, about the width of a city block. It moved at 35 miles an hour, faster than a person can run. Now, the strangest and most lethal thing about this wave is something a Harvard fluid dynamics researcher named Nicole Sharp would not formally describe until nearly 100 years later. Molasses is what scientists call a non-Newtonian fluid. Under pressure, it behaves like a thin liquid. Released from pressure, it thickens back to its familiar, slow state. What that meant on January 15, 1919 was this. The wave came on like a tsunami, and then, where it stopped, it set like concrete. The first thing in its path was the children. Pasquale Iantosca was struck and killed by a fragment of a railway car carried along by the wave. Antonio D'Estasio was flung against a light pole. He would survive with a severe head injury. Maria D'Estasio was buried in the molasses and suffocated. Her playmate, Pasquale, the boy his father had bundled into 2 red sweaters, would be pulled out hours later, his small body broken, the red sweaters gummed solid brown. The wave reached the Engine 31 firehouse next. It slammed into the structure with such force that the building was knocked off its foundation. The second floor pancaked onto the first. The firefighters inside were trapped beneath the wreckage of their own station house, in a flooded basement that filled with molasses around them. They were pinned. They could not get out. George Lay, the firefighter, the husband, the man who had been inside the station moments earlier, drowned in molasses before his colleagues could reach him. A third building in the wave's path was the Cloherty House. The wave lifted the entire structure off its foundation and threw it against the steel supports of the Boston elevator. Martin Cloherty later told the Boston Globe that he woke up in several feet of molasses, thoroughly disoriented, and assumed he had somehow fallen overboard at sea. He clawed his way out of the wreckage and pulled his unconscious sister onto a piece of broken house that he treated like a raft. He searched the rubble for his mother. Bridget Cloherty, 65 years old, was buried under the splintered timbers of her own home. Rescuers eventually pulled her out alive. She died of her injuries about an hour later. The wave kept moving. It snapped the steel girders of the elevated railway. A trolley, inbound, was waved down by a witness just in time to keep from running into a section of track that no longer existed. It picked up horses, the dozens of horses tied up along Commercial Street, who pulled the wagons that delivered goods to the waterfront, and dragged them under. The Boston Post would later write that horses died like flies on sticky flypaper. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank. By the time the wave's momentum dissipated, parts of the neighborhood lay under several feet of molasses. The air temperature, falling now as the afternoon wore on, began to cool the syrup. And as the molasses cooled, it thickened. And as it thickened, it stopped releasing the people trapped inside it. The first responders, Boston Police, the Red Cross, firefighters, and more than 100 cadets from the USS Nantucket, a Navy training ship docked nearby, arrived within minutes. They were almost helpless. Saws would not cut the molasses, brooms only smeared it. They could see hands, they could see faces. They could not pull people out. Some of the dead would not be recovered for days. By the time the sun set on January 15, 1919, 21 people were dead or dying. 150 more were injured. And the United States Industrial Alcohol Company was preparing the story it was going to tell about it. USIA's lawyers moved quickly. By the next day, the company was in the press with its explanation. The tank had not failed. The tank had been bombed. Italian anarchists, they said. Terrorist saboteurs. The same kind of radicals who had been planting bombs in cities across the United States for years. The same kind of radicals who had, and this part was technically true, set off a bomb at a USIA facility in Brooklyn back in 1916. This was, in 1919, a story that the American press was prepared to believe. The country was in the grip of what historians now call the First Red Scare. There had been roughly 40 bombings in the Boston area alone in the year leading up to the Molasses Flood. Italian anarchist groups had specifically targeted USIA before. The story fit. There was only one problem with it. Everyone who lived on Commercial Street knew the tank had been leaking for 3.5 years. Everyone who worked at the tank knew it groaned every time it was filled. Isaac Gonzalez had resigned in fear 4 months earlier, and 6 weeks after the disaster, in February of 1919, Superior Criminal Court Judge Wilfred Bolster released a preliminary report on the collapse. He called the tank significantly flawed and illegal. He called the incident manslaughter through negligence. No criminal charges were ever filed. Arthur Gell would never see the inside of a courtroom as a defendant. But the families of the dead, and the injured, and the homeless did something that in 1919 was almost unheard of. More than 100 plaintiffs, often cited as 119, filed civil suits against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. The Massachusetts Supreme Court consolidated them into a single proceeding. It would become one of the largest legal proceedings of its kind in Massachusetts history, and one of the largest in the United States to that point. The case was called Dorr versus United States Industrial Alcohol. To hear it, the court appointed an auditor, effectively a special judge, named Colonel Hugh W. Ogden. Ogden was a Harvard-trained lawyer. He had served in the First World War as judge advocate of the 42nd Infantry, the famous Rainbow Division, alongside General Pershing and a young Douglas MacArthur. He was, by every account, a serious man. The trial began in August of 1920. It would not end for nearly 5 years. The hearings stretched for years, producing nearly 1,000 witnesses, more than 1,500 exhibits, and roughly 25,000 pages of transcripts. So many lawyers were involved that the courtroom in Suffolk County could not physically contain them. USIA, defending itself, spent $50,000 on expert witnesses to try to prove sabotage. Their lead attorney, Charles Francis Choate, argued for years that an Italian anarchist had blown up the tank. He produced experts. He produced theories. He produced everything except evidence. The plaintiff's attorney, Damon Hall, argued something simpler. He argued that the tank was too thin, the steel was wrong, the rivets were wrong, the construction had been rushed and unsupervised, and that you cannot place 2.5 million gallons of a heavy liquid in the middle of a residential neighborhood and then claim you bear no responsibility when it falls on the children playing below it. Arthur Gell took the stand. Under oath, he admitted he had no engineering training. He admitted he had not commissioned an architect. He admitted he had skipped the standard water fill test. He admitted that workers had brought him shards of cracked steel and that he had told them the tank still stood. On April 28, 1925, 6 years, 3 months, and 13 days after the wave came down Commercial Street, Ogden released his ruling. He rejected the sabotage defense outright. He found no evidence of a bomb. He found, instead, a long, documented, undeniable history of corporate negligence. He assigned full liability to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. He ordered the company to pay $628,000 in damages, somewhere between $8 and $12 million in today's money, to the victims, their families, the city of Boston, and the Boston Elevated Railway. Families of the dead received, on average, about $7,000 per victim, roughly $130,000 in modern terms, for a child, for a wife, for a son in 2 red sweaters. It was, by the standards of 1925, a historic verdict. It became an important early milestone in American corporate liability and construction regulation. In the years that followed, Massachusetts and most other states passed laws requiring engineers to be professionally licensed, requiring building plans to be sealed by a registered architect, requiring municipal inspections of major construction. The Great Boston Molasses Flood, as the historian Stephen Puleo would later put it, did for American construction standards what the Coconut Grove fire would later do for fire codes. The verdict was historic. The price was not. 21 people died on January 15, 1919. 18 of them were Irish city workers and Italian immigrants. Most of them were laborers, drivers, firemen, blacksmiths, children gathering firewood. The kind of people whose names, the historian Stephen Puleo writes, you have not heard before, and that you will not hear again. Arthur Gell was never charged with a crime. He was never named in public by any court as the man responsible for the deaths of 21 people. He continued his career. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company did not rebuild the tank. There was no need. Prohibition had changed the alcohol business, and what little remained could be made more efficiently another way. The site on Commercial Street was eventually cleared. Today, it is a small public park called Langone Park. There is a baseball diamond. There are benches. There is a small bronze plaque, easy to miss, about the size of a sheet of paper. In the weeks after the disaster, every house in the North End, every brick in every wall, every horse and human and cobblestone was coated in a brown film that no amount of fresh water could remove. It was firefighters from the Engine 31 fireboat, the same fireboat whose station house had been destroyed by the wave, who finally figured out that salt water would cut the molasses. They pumped Boston Harbor through hoses, and slowly, over weeks, the streets came clean. But the smell did not leave. For decades afterward, residents of the North End reported that on hot summer days, when the sun came down on the brick and the asphalt, they could smell it, a faint, sweet, ghostly trace of molasses, rising up out of streets that had been washed 1,000 times. Some said they could still smell it in the 1980s. The wave moved at 35 miles an hour. The forgetting moved faster. But the neighborhood itself, the bricks and the air and the harbor, refused to forget. It held on to Pasquale Iontosca and his 2 red sweaters. It held on to Maria de Stasio. It held on to every name on that small bronze plaque.